Alright, let's look at Desert Fox and Trail of the Fox together, since I played them together. First of all, from a fairly objective standpoint, not necessarily my tastes here, I think Desert Fox is one of the finest war games ever made. I was kind of surprised to see its rating lower than some others. But when you think about, hey, most willing to play or whatever, I can see where that could taint it a little bit, because it is a little, it's what I'd call too requiring of thought for me. It is very much a puzzle game. In fact, both of them are, in the sense, not that you're trying to solve some single puzzle, but that it keeps presenting you with puzzle after puzzle. It also presents you with these agonizing choices. Both of them do. Where if you want to do what you want to do, you almost have to make decisions that you really don't want to make. You have to make attacks or sacrifice units or something that is painful. That in most games, you're really not required to do that kind of thing. You look at the attack ratios and you say, man, that just doesn't look good. And it's difficult with the... So this was tremendously innovative. And I don't know that anything's really managed it, although the OCS series probably comes closest, is the combat table for the game. The way this sucker works with the shifts, which I screwed up in the first couple plays, or the first couple turns, until it was pointed out I forgot how they really work, and the it's just very, the different morale levels on the defender and everything, it's really hard to contemplate exactly what your odds are. You could spend forever looking at that chart trying to figure out just what your chance of attack is. And in a lot of ways, other than hitting a certain odds number and a certain number of column shifts, there's not a lot you can really do there. You can kind of say, well, you know, I want to bump myself past these little buys that get me an extra layer. So if I can get from 2-1 to 3-1 in the clear, 2-1 to 3-1 is the big change across the board. That seems good. But honestly, you might be okay at the 1-1 in the clear, especially if you've got more shifts coming to you. Especially if you have the enemy surrounded so that he has to take real losses. There's just so many... It's so difficult to get a grasp on this game as you're playing it. For me, it feels like I can almost calculate out good attacks, and then I look and I say, no, those really aren't good. I can't quite do it because the opponent's reaction capability is going to break my attacks. I'm just in too much trouble. It looks like the game really favors defense, but then actually when you start playing it, the attack is fairly powerful. The charts are very forgiving to kind of lower odds attacks. So if that defender does throw in some reinforcements, you still have a fair chance of getting that 1-1 attack to work for you, or whatever. The complexity of the chart, the die roll mixed in with it, the attack shifts or defense shifts, which only affect the guy that's being fired at or whatever, these things all just add up to this ball, which is hard to unwind, and it's hard enough to unwind that you can kind of make those decisions largely shooting from the hip. What you can't do shooting from the hip at all is your supply status. You have to have that sucker figured out to the exact number, basically. Unless you're in the situation that I was in Trail of the Fox, where there's huge quantities, and late in Desert Fox, where there's such huge quantities of Allied supplies coming in from the Egyptian direction, from the east, that you can kind of just assume, yeah, it's going to be good enough. I throw all my dumps up front, and I've got enough reserve that I can pull up for the next move. Although we did even see one turn where I couldn't leapfrog my supply quickly enough just because of a double turn situation or something like that. That's another thing, control of initiative. You have this additional little piece which can, you already have this move attack type formatting with only motorized units in that second range. But, well, for movement. And reaction. And you have a reaction move built in there. So that becomes this very, mobile and fluid situation from that. But then you have the initiative as to who goes first being somewhat controlled by the players. So that you not only get your sort of guaranteed double turn in terms of the move attack, but you also can get a double turn where you get that combination of regular movement and then the exploitation. And it's all your units moving in the first movement phase, and most of your units, your mobile ones, moving in the second phase. So you have this real, ability to shake the whole campaign up with a double turn, or even just with attacking at low odds, looking for weaknesses. Once you find one, then exploiting it with all your remaining units crashing through. Good reason to actually keep some reserves in this. One is there's troops you won't need in the front line to get you your odds charts. You do want to put everything you can in the front in terms of getting the best odds chart that you can in general. It's not good for reserves in the sense of, so OCS kind of gives you exploitation only with your reserves, which makes reserves really, really important. There's something you can throw into the battle after you've gotten your breakthrough, and a lot of games have done that. In this one, you want to maximize your odds along the front, which might mean throwing every piece in because you don't know where the enemy's going to move to on his reaction. But then the pieces might get damaged, which is a reason to kind of hold a few back. As the defender, you really want to hold some back because they have that reaction fluidity. In some cases, what you want to do is place every other hex to defend, but then put some ancillary forces to react. It's hard to react with artillery, though. It tends to not have the highest morale. And if it fails its morale check, it doesn't get to shoot anymore. So that's, you kind of have to decide what your risks are there. That kind of makes sense when you're putting down firing fields. So that kind of agonizing decision, that kind of puzzle solving is present in both games. Reminds me a little bit of something much more recent in terms of that kind of real hard decision making to make, which is the No Retreat game. That hit me with the same kind of, oh my God, what can I do? This really will hit you with that. If you're like me, it'll put you in a paralysis position. And that's why I say not necessarily by my tastes, right? The other thing is this is a fairly strong simulation. The one place where it gets weakest in simulation, I think, is the supply net. One thinks that the design decision of building this interesting supply net, which creates these really cool or devastatingly painful problems with trying to arrange supplying your units without losing dumps. It's a completely gamey answer, though. There's this fully intuitive answer, which works perfectly fine in OCS. It worked in the original Africa. I think they took it out of Africa too. just to make it a baby game or whatever. The SCS tends not to have that kind of stuff, but Africa was, I think, the first of the SCS games, and it felt like OCS a little light. Well, its supply net is a lot easier to deal with in the sense of you just move supplies up and you use them. Just like OCS, you move supplies up and you use them. You just need pieces to move them up. Well, in this, instead of... Africa uses mixed pieces as well, but you consume them. Instead of consuming them, you have kind of a breaking point. If your supply net is rich enough, it's assumed that you have enough supplies coming in from Tunisia, from Tripoli, or from Alexandria or whatever, that you can feed that supply net. As long as you get the net itself built, you're not going to have any troubles. I'm not sure how realistic that is. But it involves setting pieces aside that you're not using to fuel the combat. It involves this perhaps leapfrogging of supply when you're on an advance, or very carefully hoarding your supply and protecting it on a withdrawal. So in some senses, that abstraction, that kind of gaminess that's applied there, may actually represent something real that's just ignored in the OCS SCS games. It may be something that's only really applicable here because the absolute of supplies may have had more to do with the ability to channel them from a location. You didn't have necessarily X amount of supply available. Quite often there was a bunch of supply sitting around on Tripoli's docks with no way to move it. I'm hoping the OCS can represent that properly by giving you lots of supply points but not enough mobility points. That's one way to do it, there's no question. But this handles it, and I think the reasoning behind why it was designed this way was you've got 255 counters or whatever it is that SPI gave you, in 256 or something like that. They give you a certain size counter sheet, and, well, what do you want to do? Less combat units or fewer units to build your supply system out of? And Berg chose to use fewer units for the supply system. I think he came up with something that's a brilliant little gamey mechanism. It really challenges you to work within it. But I'm not convinced that it is a good simulation of how supply is moved and you know, how troops are supplied in combat and otherwise in particular. Because supply is expended. And to some extent or another, I don't care how good your supply line is, it's not going to be able to magically generate supplies, which is what this feels like it kind of does. Then again, you have infinite supply sources in these games as well. So if you get close enough to those, you have as much supply as you want. There's a pure, full network behind them, feeding to them, that you just don't get to see a thing about. About the play of the game, Desert Fox runs as this really nice game with very much like the East Front games, and this is one of the reasons I think North Africa and the East Front are so popular, is one side, and Bulge too, to tell you the truth, one side's on the offensive and then the other side's on the offensive. Very clean, very clear. It's not, you know, one side always attacking throughout the game. Trail of the Fox, your opportunities for real offensives as the Axis are low. That's one thing against it. Another thing is components. I went through this in my videos, but you know, the TSR era components are really crappy, especially the counters in this game. The map is fine. But the counters for the original are works of art, essentially. I mean, they're just so simplistic. They convey all the information. They do it without any garishness. They're not stupid glossy counters that when you try to pick up a stack, half of it flies out. Yeah. I don't like glossy counters, and it's a pity that some of the graphics of today kind of require them, I guess. It also feels like the designers of the second game of Trail of the Fox, the whole team is completely different. Everybody has gone from TSR at this point. I'm not sure about that because Berg wrote Baton Rouge around this time. But I think he did that on an external contract. He was no longer staff. It feels like they kind of misunderstood some aspects of the game, and that you might have to tinker and tweak with it. Another thing that's kind of weird about Trail of the Fox is it gives you, really actually both of them do this, they give you kind of a historical goals being possible. I guess it depends on the player. For Desert Fox, if you want the all-out victory, you will play historically. If you play for a limited victory from the very beginning, you will not play completely historically. You'll either go for Tobruk and nothing and not push too much further on, or you'll push further on and try to lock down a defense around Tobruk and a defense at El Alamein, and you will not try to pursue the Alexandria attack. Obviously, Rommel wouldn't be stretching where he was, except to take Alexandria. You know, that was his goal. He wanted that game. With Trail of the Fox, I think that following Rommel's goals, which probably were far and away the best for the Axis, pulling back everything to Tunisia and trying to marshal the troops together and get them out of that pocket as well as he could, and eventually Kesselring, I believe, does that. Well, that's not what the game's about. The game's about how long can you keep some stupid foothold somewhere in North Africa. Now, maybe you could convince me that Hitler and Mussolini were interested in that. But that's not what the General Staff was interested in. They were interested in sending that surge of force in to help get the Afrika Korps out, to help get it out safely. They had no illusions about being able to hold Libya, return to the offensive, or anything like that. They knew that the time was up in North Africa, and it was time to save as much of their army as they could. And if it meant committing more army to do so, that's fine. So you may have these conflicting goals, but the player is playing the military commander. And quite honestly, he has no concern for his troops at all and isn't trying to get them out in any kind of timetable or with any kind of safety. All he cares about is holding a port until as long as he can. There's some aspect of that which could be delaying Allied operations in the Mediterranean, which you could take into account too, as being of some value. But I don't know how important that really is, because you can delay them anywhere. You know, it's the Mediterranean. It's not going to be hard to launch an invasion there, particularly compared to, say, the North Sea. Anyway, playing them together kind of magnifies the oddness of the victory conditions. If you play them with sort of the right spirit, you can get historical results. If you're playing with someone who's looking for a game to win, well, you still have an interesting game. There's no question about that, with either, both, whatever, with some interesting decisions. But I think, especially with Trail of the Fox, you're probably pushing the game a little too far in the Axis advantage. Because if they don't push too hard, if they don't lose too many of their troops in the campaign in Egypt, then they have a lot more on the defensive when they're just trying to hold one city for as long as they can. And that is not that hard. My screw-ups in Egypt, or in Libya and Tobruk, helped me conserve forces for the later Trail of the Fox. So I kind of look at it as, I'm playing two games, and this is how I judged it for myself. How well did I do in Desert Fox? given that I do want to turn around and run away eventually, and how well did I do in Trail of the Fox in terms of meeting its objectives, because there's no real way of measuring anything else in that game. I'm kind of, I'm surprised with the fact that Desert Fox only has a little over a 7. It was, in its time, definitely one of the best received designs that came out. And it's a real classic game. Trail of the Fox, I haven't played it enough to have a lot of insight into it. I feel like that same core system still gives you a lot of interesting opportunities. There's still a mobile defense that can strike in both games. That's just core to the system. But there's less of the change of overall direction of the campaign. You're less likely to be doing any kind of sustained defensive with the Axis and Trail of the Fox. And that could disappoint some people. Some people want to be on both attack and defense. Me, I'd rather just be on defense because attack is agonizing for me. I don't think that I can do it. But on the other hand, I kind of want to always be the Axis because I almost don't trust other players to try to take Alexandria. I just inherently am never sure if somebody's willing to, and I'm not sure if I am sometimes, to throw the victory of the game, an assured victory in the game, away in order to try to play the game as I see that it was meant to be played. Anyway. Both, I think, decent games. Trail gets an even worse rating, and almost nobody plays it anymore. That's odd to me because although I almost never played it either, so maybe not that odd, and I've played Desert Fox a decent number of times for me, maybe 10, 12 times. And not always as poorly as I did this time, but probably not too far. But I would think that given how popular Desert Fox was, a decent number of people would have wanted to play Trail. And I don't see anything terribly wrong with the game. Although it's hard to tell because I didn't play with the Trail alone scenario. I can see where people wouldn't want to combine the two. For me, it's sort of, I don't know, I've never played Trail without combining them. I don't know if I've ever actually played Trail. I've tried several times, I just may never have gotten that far. Alright, anyway. This was definitely a decent amount of fun, even though I screwed up some things. But I always screw up things, right? I don't think my screw-ups really destroyed the game too much. More my strategic screw-ups. I'm very much not the kind of person who can handle the amount of thought that's involved in this game. But I do get pleasure out of it anyway.